Okay, for this video, I'm going to cover just real briefly the 7 themes that Krugman addresses in Chapter 1. Chapter 1 just gives you a real nice overview of some of the big ideas in trade. You can definitely pretty much skim through this chapter. There's not like a whole lot of details here, but it will give you a good framework and a good foundation for what's to come as we go. So first we've got number 1. The first theme that he covers is the gains from trade. Right. So gains from trade are, on the whole, trade is great, right? It's always going to benefit not only the two people in the exchange, but also society as a whole will get wealthier when exchanges occur. Where things get messed up and it can sometimes get sticky is not everybody benefits, right? So society as a whole, the average person in society gets better. But as we know, there is no average person in society. Society is made up of a bunch of individuals. The average American does not exist. So when we think about how trade with, say, China impacts America, yes, the nation as a whole gets wealthier, but there will be some individuals that might lose their jobs when we trade with China. So that is a sticking point and an issue that comes up a lot when we discuss trade. So there's always going to be trade-offs. This happens with innovation too. It's not just trade, right? Anything that makes one area more productive than another is going to put people out of business. So as society gets wealthier, there are going to be things where we have to figure out, okay, how do we want to deal with this? So that's some of the stuff that we'll talk about this semester, is the trade-offs that happen when we open up to trade. Okay. So he also discusses the pattern of trade. Okay, so for example, who do we trade with and why? Why do we trade so much with the Chinese? Why do we trade? First of all, who do we trade the most with? What would be your guess? Do we trade more with China or more with Mexico? Do we trade more with England or more with Canada? These are some really good questions that we ask, and Chapter 2 does kind of address some of that. Chapter 2 gives some of those answers to those questions, why we trade with the nations that we do, using what's called the gravity model, which we'll get into in the next video. Okay, so pattern of trade, why do we trade with who we do? Another broad theme is protection. All right, so protectionism, okay. How do we figure out what our trade policy is going to be in America? And what's interesting and what you find is it's not so much politics between America and China that determines that as much as it is domestic politics. So what do Americans tell the American government they want? And in China, of course, it's more driven by the Chinese government as opposed to the people, right? But it's done domestically. Domestically, people figure things out and fight and struggle through. And then, the finishing touches are put in the international sphere. Okay. Then we'll talk about balance of payments. This is one of the more complex ideas that underpins international economics, and it has to do with the difference between flows of goods and services, flows of currencies, flows of financial assets. Okay, and so how do all these things balance out? So we'll definitely go into more detail on that later. The exchange rate is something that changes over time, and how that is determined has changed over time. Before World War I, the exchange rate was just based on gold. So you had a period of the international gold standard in the late 19th century through to World War I. After World War II, there was a period where the dollar, all nations pegged, a group of nations anyways, pegged their currencies to the dollar under the Bretton Woods conventions. But since 1971, we've had floating exchange rates. Some countries still pegged to the dollar, some unofficially pegged to the dollar, but for the most part now, currencies are determined by trade in the markets for currencies. Okay. This is exchange rates are really fun to work with, and it's interesting to see how they impact the flows of goods and services over borders. Then we have international policies boards, so such as the WTO is who we currently have running our international policy, and then before the WTO there was something called the GATT. Okay, and you'll learn about those things in more depth later on. And then the last thing is the international capital markets. Okay, so those are the 7 underlying principles, kind of like big ideas that Krugman has that will kind of flow through his text throughout. So good to be familiar with them, have a general idea of what they are. He does a good job in his text of giving some detail and some meat on those bones, but no need to go through and memorize all the facts and then memorize the 7 things that are underneath. It's just a good framework to work with. So hope that helps, and there'll be one more video up in this on chapter 2.